Hello, welcome to Clans and Dynasties. Today I'm joined by Ruadh Butler, famous author of the Swordland series. I will post a link at that below. Great books. Also, all round just lover of especially Norman history in Ireland. And today we are covering a very, very important person in Irish history and someone who I believe is very close to Ruadh's heart. It should be, because without him he wouldn't be here today, and that is Theobald Fitzwalter, aka Butler. So yeah, let's get the show on the road. Unlike how I'd normally on Irish Medieval Histories, the podcast, throw our guest under the bus. Ruadh's an old hand at this now, so he doesn't get just thrown under. So I'll start and give him a couple of seconds to just get comfortable. I think, although we're going to be covering Theobald, just a wee bit of background information on him and his family. Theobald is really the first person that, well, apart from his father, we have basic records, is really the first person that comes into the Butler contemporary records that we can sort of definite prove who he was, when he was born, where he lived, and his life leading to that. The Butler family, there are sort of a few myths on how they came about. One of them is Henry Walter, a noble who came across in 1066 with William the Conqueror, and was a lord who fought in this battle and was given Benham in Norfolk. There's not really any contemporary records for that. I'm not saying it's not true for any butlers out there who maybe feel that that is the truth there, but we've only got about 35 nobles that can be verified in contemporary records who fought for William the Conqueror, and only 15 of those really have got sons and daughters that we can prove again, so the descendants of them. So really it all comes down to Theobald and his sort of his father and uncles. That's sort of the branch we sort of go down. So his mother was and I'm gonna butcher this French here because they were speaking French at the time. Is the Vallones?
I would say Valogne.
Yeah, Valogne.
So like Valogne.
Yeah,
Valogne.
There you go. A much better sort of interpretation there. But a noble family in they were all over East and North England. Very powerful family at the time, and this sort of gives us an indication of his standing in society at the time as well. Even though he and his father sort of just come into the records that we have now, you can sort of get a clear picture on their standing in society. They weren't just ragtag nobodies. They were obviously people of prestige and nobility for them to marry into a family. And just to show you how prominent the Vallones were, at the time, this family had connections to Scotland, had connections obviously in England, and had connections in Ireland. They were justiciars of Ireland from 1196 to 1199, one of the kinsmen of the Vallones. I think it was her uncle. So this is just shows how prominent this family must have been for them to get that sort of connection. Now, obviously, we have Hubert. See, that's you're just here to.
He was probably Hubert.
Hubert, there you go. So you're just here just to correct my terrible pronunciations of Old English and French. Was Theobald's brother as well. So we're going to just like I said, it's a bit of background information. And he was the Archbishop of Canterbury. So this is just shows you again the fact he rose to that position. A lot of second sons during that time were sent to the church. Many, almost like it was more political than anything else, and to show that he rose to such prominence again is a clear sign that this family, although again no contemporary early records, had to have been important back then. So where do you want to start in his early life then? Is maybe his rearing and who his connections were?
Yeah, that it is. Well, maybe the first thing to do is to say thank you for inviting me, and yeah, it's good to talk about Theobald Walter because he, in the Butler family, even though he's the up of the tree, really, he's not one of the ones that really crops up at all that often. You know, you've got a few people down the line who you know reach greater prominence than him. The Black Tom Butler, who was in sort of Elizabethan era, the Duke of Ormond, who was at the same time as Charles I and Charles II, but Theobald Walter is one of my favorites. We don't know a terrible lot about him, but he is one of my favorites. And I'm just going to show this off for a second. We'll hopefully get a picture of this sent through. But this is, if you can still hear me, my family tree. It's probably the wrong way around for you, but that's the coat of arms there. Ooh, are we getting a bit thing? This is the coat of arms of the Butler Earls of Ormond. And they depict the three cups, the three golden cups in the red, which is sort of closest to my finger. And then the other bit, the blue on yellow, is I'm going to try and get as close as possible.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Is actually the coat of arms that probably Hubert and Theobald would have recognised. And I'm going to set this down because it's quite heavy. The coat of arms is actually supposed to have been taken from the Glanville family, this very famous Norman, maybe a little bit of Anglo-Saxon thrown in as well, family from East Anglia. And it's really pretty much from them where the Butlers started to get introduced to court and really find some prominence in the English England before they came to Ireland. Theobald Walter's father was a chap called Harvey Walter. And he wasn't Fitzwalter, as far as we know. He was Harvey Walter, which is strange in a time when we didn't have surnames. His family seems to have had a surname, Walter, which is a complete weird one in itself. So where that came from, we're going to have to just draw a line under it and say we don't really know at the moment. However, Walter was a surname that was inherited by his son, Theobald Walter. His mother, and Hubert Walter, his younger brothers, and the younger brothers from there as well. Hubert's and Theobald's mother was a lady we called Maud de Valois, and her sister was Bertha de Valois, who was married into the Glanville family, and her husband was called Ranulph de Glanville. And another person who should be one of the best known people in English history, in my opinion, because he wrote all sorts of legal treatises and law that we now sort of call or have become common law and is throughout the world. And it was him and presumably, possibly Hubert Walter and his younger brother Osbert that wrote this great, crazy, important law for the whole of Western society. Anyway, that was how the Butler family connected to the Glanvilles. And presumably, Theobald grew up in Ranulph de Glanville's household. And Ranulph started out life in the sort of the mid 1160s, 1170s, 1180s as a sheriff of Yorkshire and sort of northern part of England. Hugely important, particularly given it was the time of Henry II, who didn't like to give up power too easily. So he wasn't made an earl, but he probably had the same standing as an earl, as a sheriff. And Ranulph was a very, very important person who, under Henry II, actually rose to become Justiciar of England, basically your prime minister in all but name. And of course, as Ranulph climbed up the steps, as far as political power, Theobald was kind of his go-to guy for getting things done. So presumably this young knight who was, I presume, born sort of in the 1140s, that sort of period, by the 1170s, in his mid-30s, was being, really important to de Glanville and kind of part of his household, go-getters and people he sent out on jobs and to get things done, while he was, part of his executive council. Yeah. So, it's the Glanville arms that the Butlers bore for much of their early life until basically the Tudor period, when they added those three cups, wine goblets. And that was one of their most important connections of the Butler family and to Theobald Walter.
Yeah. Well, that's to say, it's the Glanvilles are a really understated family in English history. I feel as well. Covering Scottish history, they also have a footprint there. During the early times. So, and like say, being just this year, a high sheriff, and eventually sort of cut back to a sheriff, and that would be very much touch on your how the king didn't like to give away too much power, and he did a big clean in house and sort of brought everyone down a wee bit, but he was still held in high regard, and this is very important. Something we've touched on in previous discussions on the podcast, that a lot of these families that would move across to Ireland had these very strong power bases going across, and the Butlers were no different. The Glanvilles were a very powerful family in Northern England. The Vallones were a pretty powerful family, sort of mid-level, but there were still, the connections were there. It was a very, very sort of almost like celebrities at the time, very small elite nobility then was very small elite families, all connected, and they weren't afraid to use those connections when they needed to, and the Butlers would have been no different. And I wonder if maybe the usage of the Glanville's coat of arms, it wasn't uncommon for coat of arms to pass through female lines, much like a double-barreled surname. If you want your surname to survive, you would use that someone else's coat of arms, or eventually some of them would sort of break it up like the cups on yours. But some Norman families would take a maternal shield as their own, and it was almost a way of used as a compromise if they weren't going to take the wife's surname and bring that down. Some families were accepting to use the shield, so this could have been seen, and it's purely speculatory on my part here, but it wasn't uncommon at the time. It could have been seen as a way of honouring their uncle and saying, look, I will pass down your this coat of arms through my line, and that would have been seen almost like, he's must have been like an heir to this man, regardless of him having children. So that would definitely, from my understanding of the history anyway, not just the Butler history, but in general, it would show a very close connection, which no doubt helped them rise the ranks. Sure. Yeah, maybe it could have been one of those, we'll just we're not really fond of him, but he'll get us places kind of thing. I don't know how he was as a man. So, but
this is, a lot of this will be speculatory because we just don't know for certain about the relationships. I'm just as you're on that, I was thinking about the Burke family who had adopted perhaps the coat of arms of the more powerful Mandeville family, who were next door neighbours to them in Eastern Anglia, East Anglia, and so these things can travel in many, many ways. There was a familial connection with the Glanvilles. Some people have speculated that actually a few generations before that the Butlers were actually born of the same maternal or paternal line, and they were actually the Glanvilles as well. Yeah. Other people suggest that it was, and sometimes they just say it because of the coat of arms that they were the Glanville. Very great family, the Glanvilles, but who knows at this stage. Other people say that there might not even be Normans at all, that they might be descended from this Frankish chap called Harvey de Truensis, I think it means, which is from the county of Berry in France. Right. So a Frankish family, which would be great. That's fine with me. I'm happy with that. The others again say they're possibly from Breton lines. So there's so many ways that the Butlers may not even be Normans. Maybe one of these other continental breeds.
Well, I must admit, I would normally, when I do my research on a family, I sort of plug into DNA groups and sort of see what they're sort of talking about as well. Because as we both know, that DNA is really just the thing that's the way forward when it comes to now our surname histories, because we get a clearer picture. And I didn't get the chance on the Butlers yet to actually plug into anything, but I would be interested, because I also seen that in some of the online family trees there was even claims of a Declare link as well, the same link as the Declares, which I thought was an interesting thing, and I wouldn't discredit that these sort of links exist, even in maternal links, through marriages and stuff, and they could be claimed, but the there wouldn't be, the when you sort of see Theobald, the Norman invasion is about 100 years old by then. It's so I wouldn't claim any sort of local link to the, there was very few Anglo-Saxon families that stayed very prominent. Swinton family and the Berkeleys have claim to them, but if you take into, I think maybe the Nevilles maybe claim a link as well, but that there are northern families for the most part, kind of on the furthest reaches of the Norman grass very early in. But where you are with the Butlers, you're in East Anglia, you're in the lower end of East Anglia as well. I think you're well within the grasp of London at the time and that reach. So I feel that Cornwall has in that time has some sort of old Brythonic families still cutting about, but it wouldn't be long before they were overshadowed and replaced. So I would sort of discount personally any sort of native link to England at the time, and definitely say that they were a family that was introduced during or if not shortly after the invasion. There was a lot of families that came across just after. A lot of people like to claim that link to the famous battle of Hastings, but
you were there, you're on that hill, or at the bottom of that hill probably.
Yeah, and then we ran away and then we tricked them and ran back.
The old trick.
Well, the Butlers were very tricky, so I wonder if they were the ones on the field telling them if you go there and do this.
Comes your truth, my friend, as I find it. No tricks, nothing like that.
But what is it? Was this your card? That's my bank card.
But we probably use the old cup one, the 3 cups. That's what that was about.
Yeah, just got that there. Hopefully anyone watches this will be a lot quicker than I am. But no, but yes, I seen a lot of links here, and actually I did get put through to someone who commented on another video of mine, a lot of links to Breton families who came across to Scotland under David I, and their coat of arms and how the links. There's a gap in a lot of families, but how they're trying to link the two between coats of arms and stuff. Yeah. Which is I'll put a link to that there. A book he put me to. If anyone's interested in coats of arms, and the theory of how they've come across from the mainland. It does look like it's going to be a good read. I haven't read it yet. It was only put to me yesterday. Give me time. And if it turns out to be rubbish, comment below. But we digress. Yes, so that was the links there that we can see with the family and where it possibly came from. I'm a firm, supporter of a Norman / Breton Frankish link. Especially to the heights they reached, within the first 100 years. They had to have been within the same sort of sphere as these other big families. But yeah,
the two you've just mentioned, the Glanvilles and the Valoins, who are sort of very much Norman French families. So my presumption is this is probably another Norman French family. Yeah. Whether we'll ever find out who they really are, who knows? I've never taken a DNA test. I really don't want to, but maybe.
You should. I've taken one, and I'm gonna have to hand it over to a professional because it says I'm related to the Burns or O'Burns family, which is very strange. Although they're very prominent in the area my family's from.
I'd take that.
Yeah, I'm happy enough, but I just. I'm a Doyle, so I'm a bit confused as why there's an O'Byrne there.
I want to see Scandinavia.
Yeah, I've got Norway links, but they're from my mother's side, so not from my father's. So I have questions.
That's interesting. I find it very interesting. To me personally, I'll lift this and just show you the names at the top if you can see them. None of the.
Yes, I can see them. Yeah, there we go. Good one.
This was compiled by my cousin Paddy, who lives in Mayo, and he wouldn't be one for messing around. And he would say, if he had thought there was a link or a certain link to anybody sooner or earlier than Harvey, he would definitely have added it to this family tree. He hasn't. Thus, I suspect there is none. The Clares would be great. I think they're Dukes of Normandy at some stage, or linked to them as well. So That'd be lovely. Oh, give me a link to Strongbow for God's sake. I'd love that. But no, I'm happy just being the linked to some guy who made good thanks to his uncle, made good and made his way up the tree through sheer skill alone. That's good enough for me.
But he also married pretty well as well, and the Vavasour.
I've actually seen that surname exists to this day, so there are Vavasours out there. So,
well, I noticed that it is funny that a lot of the Norman families that I would sort of research, they do die out very quickly. But we do see these names exist, but not in noble lines. And I often wonder, are they illegitimate, or do they sort of follow, back in the day, before commoners really got surnames, did they follow a very similar attitude to, say, like the ancient Romans, where you're a freeman in the land of Butler? Did you take the name Butler, to sort of give almost like a link to, if you were from a shire area, because if you, I don't say, like, if you were Thomas of London, but you were in the same village as Thomas of London, would you have been Thomas Butler London, or from the west? You just so I've often thought, is there links basically of an adoption of a name, of your noble's name, very early on, and that's why we see quite a lot of, because there are quite a lot of old names in England, yet none of them managed to chase up lands. I mean, these families died within about 3 or 4 generations, and you're sort of thinking to yourself, why was it, that's still quite a close proximity for a cousin to go, why am I not, I'd like that place. I'd like to be Baron of so and so.
It would be, you'd be thinking they would be putting the foot forward for that one, wouldn't you?
I would have thought so. And I don't know whether it's just maybe charters are lost, and they did, and they just were refused for whatever reason. Or they were illegitimate lines, so that, or whether more powerful people eyed up those lands and discounted their, I don't know. It's just speculation on my part, but I do wonder very early on, just because of the names that we see, like you're saying here, the Vavasour, they're still about, yet none of them hold in the paternal line. None of them hold, especially in a very paternal society. That they don't hold the lands that they hold, and we see so many families do. Like I said, 35 that we know about of the Norman lords that come across that we can verify in contemporary sources, and only 15 of them have descendants today, or have descendants. Sorry, not even today. We can just prove they have descendants.
Literally have people.
Yeah, but that's it. And I guarantee 90% of them are maternal links, not paternal. I've spent my days off just researching families, and I can tell you right now, it's just it's just paternal links that I follow mostly, and it just dead end. Most of my days just dead ends. That's why I like Scottish and Irish families. We weren't big, like just 15 children, no problem.
They're out there. I was just thinking about the Lacey family who were in Ireland, and the way that there were junior branches of the family, but the lands passed down a couple of generations, male line. Then they had a couple of daughters, and actually it was the daughters' inheritance. The all the land and titles. People sort of talk about Normans being really mean because they only gave all the land primogeniture and all that. Yeah. Very often the lands get split up amongst all the daughters, and so you have these names not disappearing but going off, and like there are loads of Lacey's about in Ireland at the moment. Yeah, the descendants of Hugh de Lacy are out there and existing. One of them used to be a referee.
Funny you say that. It's actually happened to the Valoins. It's one of the reasons very early on that it was 3 heiresses that got the land split between them, I believe the Butlers got some of that land as well through their their links. So, but it was very common. It is genetic that we have more daughters than men. It's so we can survive as a race. But but it is funny how it takes only a couple of generations to decide, just completely whitewashed for whatever reason. Daughters get it, and sometimes, like I said, it is because she's married an earl, and it's just some lowland baron or whatever, and he's got eyes on the land, and let's be honest, he can get the better lawyer, or he can, or give the money, give more money to the king, or or threaten the king in some cases. So, it was one of those. It's just something that often pops into my head, and I think to myself, I wonder, especially with DNA going on. But yeah, the Vavasours, his wife, again, her father was a deputy sheriff of Lanarkshire, so another high member of society, another well-bred family, thoroughbred, and she was approximately 10 hands high, and good, beautiful man, right? And,
that locks forever.
Yeah, I'm just calling your great ancestor a horse, like, but
a horse,
a horse, my kingdom for a horse. So he married well, and not only that, but when he died, she married again.
She married well too.
Yeah, she married
the second time.
His son, she would have more children to the Fitzwarren family, who again were, I believe there's a romantic story behind all of this, but
I think myths and legends are going to come into this quite a bit. This is going to be our stop number one. I think we missed one, but we can maybe go back to myth number one. But this is myth number two, which is the Butlers are descended from Maid Marian. Bum bum bum. I presume that was where we were headed.
Yes.
Fulk Fitzwarren. Fulk Fitzwarren is a really interesting guy. I'm sure that there are books out there about him, fiction and non-fiction alike, because he did have a really interesting life. For those who don't know, he had a bit of a lifelong argument with Prince John, who would later become King John. King John gave away his family lands. This is Fulk Fitzwarren, the second husband of Maud le Vavasour, and she became. And I think it was one of the facts was that they were basically outlawed. All his lands were given to some other family, and he fought as a kind of outlaw of the Western Marches, of the Welsh Marches, and finally fought his way back to favour in some way and got his family land. So the Fitzwarrens again ran out of people, I think, but they're a pretty formidable family in the early 13th century. That's for sure.
Yeah, a lot of Warrens still. I don't know if they're related, but Fitzwarren definitely get, like you said, there's that tie-in with the old Maid Marian and Robin Hood. From what I've researched back in the day when I was mad into English lords and nobility, and especially Robin Hood, actually was probably one of my first people. Locksley, it was Costner. His film got me. I was only about 10, 11.
Prince of Thieves.
He's Prince of Thieves, and it really got me into. I grew up on the two films.
Join us or die.
Let's go to the pigs. Do you ever see the pigs? Do you ever see the way he gets his? What do you call the sheriff? And he died. Alan Rickman.
That was my best Alan Rickman impression.
I was trying to.
I'm straight over it.
No, I was trying to say that's, but I couldn't remember his name. But yes, he.
Oh no, brown cow.
He lives reincarnated. And I bet you don't love his bank account. But it was William Wallace and Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, are the two films that I sort of watched time and time again growing up. And I always wondered about the Locksley family, and I did research as I got older, and it seems like Robin Hood seems to be, like many of our myths and legends, an amalgamation of a lot of lords and a lot of nobles at the time. It seemed very commonplace for knights and landed gentry to be displaced from favour of the kings and to lose their inheritance, and most of it was very boring and done through the courts and the lot of political wrangling and favours and whatnot. But very few of them, like Fitzwarren, took up this roguery band of just fight for justice. And basically I think it would be more like 12th century terrorism, but it's but
really more talking about the Taliban than anything else.
he basically that's all it was. I'll give him my land, or I'm going to wreck around me. And but no, he was one of the ones that came into my radar then, and he is an interesting fellow to read if you do sort of. I probably will touch on English families going through on my channel anyway. Just such a huge impact going across Talbots and everything coming across to Ireland that it just wouldn't be right to leave them out. But yes, Fitzwarren's, but again, like I said, I think they had like 4 sons and a couple of daughters, and they ended up gaining a lot of land back, a lot of manors and stuff, which again was no doubt helpful to the Butler cause of rising to prominence, having these connections.
Half brothers doing well in England, that's good, yeah.
And they would have no doubt looked out for each other, because, and not just only survival of your family. We got to remember, the families in the days weren't the same as brothers the same way we are today. They probably weren't even reared together, or met at balls and gatherings and feasts, but they would have had that kinship. They would have still held on to that kinship for the sake of, scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. We are blood after all. It gives us that closer connection. Whether I might need you down the line, really. It's that sort of feeling to me.
Funny you mentioned about how they grew up, because Fulk, Prince John, Theobald Walter all did grow up together. They were not of the same age group. I think Theobald probably a little bit older than Fulk. Fitzwarren was a little bit older than Prince John. But they all did grow up together in the household of Ranulph de Glanville, this prime minister figure under King Henry II. So they actually probably knew each other. It's in Ranulph de Glanville's household that this enmity between Fulk Fitzwarren and King John is supposed to have started, because Fulk apparently was playing a game of chess against Prince John, and Fulk wiped the floor with him, absolutely defeated him, and John swept aside the pieces, and then the board was thrown by Fulk and it hit Prince John and knocked him out or did some sort of damage. And it was only Ranulph coming back and sorting things out that stopped this, but it was from that moment that these two were like really on a bit of a collision course of personalities, because I think from Fulk's point of view, he probably thought, he's the 4th son of King Henry II. He's doing nothing. This is no problem for my, this is going to have no impact on my life, because his dad's, or his big older brother's going to need me. His dad definitely needs my dad. And if Henry the young king dies, well, don't we have Richard and Geoffrey before it comes to John? So what's the what are the chances that this git is going to end up on the throne? Of course, in 1199, John did end up on the throne, and poor old Fulk Fitzwarren was basically living on borrowed time at that stage.
Well, this is the thing.
I should say it. Yeah, sorry.
No, but I should say that, living at that time, John would have gone into the lower nobility classes at best. Being the 4th son, he did. But going in, they would have gone into sort of squire for Glanville. They would have been now. Fulk being the eldest, it was a rank structure built on age and time served within your squire service. So he would have also held that sort of that I am higher ranked than you. I have, you are underneath me in this time and place right now, regardless of your nobility, regardless of who you are. Yes, a lot of young boys would have been very astute, and the fact that eventually this person's going to be higher than me. And yeah, but like you said, Fulk would have been very aware that he's 4th in line, and yeah, the death rate of children was very high, but not that high.
Anybody can have an accident.
And it's normally the youngest one. But yes, so I think there's a part to play here in the sense that he was well within his rights, that he was the boss of maybe even if he's the eldest squire, he'd have been in charge of all the others.
Of course, yeah.
So this it wouldn't have been sort of wrong for him to do it, but it didn't turn out that
Turned out to be a bad plan.
Talk about chips where they fall, but like I said, Theobald's wife, possibly Maid Marian. You said there we missed another point.
We did, yes. One that I always hear, so actually I've just sort of totting up all these legends, but one that we're descended from the De Clare, all that kind of House of Normandy, proper full-bred Normans, woo, 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 top rank. No evidence to say that that's true. 3 that we're descended, one of our mothers was Maid Marian, or a basis for Maid Marian. But number 2, related to the Valois family, I believe, is that we are descended from Thomas Becket. I've heard it so many times. I don't think there's anywhere in the family tree he can possibly fit in as far as the Butlers. So the only places that he could possibly fit in was if Hubert Walter had a first marriage that we don't really know about, and maybe that was where the blood entered into the Butler family. It wouldn't be into this section of the Butler family, but another. Or if it was in the Valois family, they had married into the Beckets. Why I don't believe it is that the Beckets at that time were very much of a merchant class. They were Normans, but they were very much, a merchant class family. They were still, very talented businessmen, probably pretty wealthy, but just weren't of the same social standing as the Valois family, or even close to it. So I doubt it was true, but it's consistently, it was even believed by the descendants of the Butlers, the Earls of Ormond, who were Butlers themselves, obviously, but they believed that they were descendants of Thomas Becket. So, this is another myth.
I mean,
comes in.
I don't see very often merchant class families marrying into nobility. Yes, the landed side of the families. To later on, when basically the nobility was selling off their titles because the merchant class, middle class, and basically were richer than the landed gentry class, and it was all to do with money. The nobility of England was so poor, and they owned all this land, and it was worth nothing. And the merchants of society were just cleaning up around them and were buying up this land. So I would say it's a bit of a leap, but it's not unheard of. But just because of how prominent the Butlers are, it's not like the Butlers were a family struggling at that time. I would sort of look at to say, well, what is that family doing at the time? Are they part of are they a martial lord? Are they on the fringes of the kingdom, not really getting enough revenue that we see? I mean, yes, a great sort of later on, but we do see a lot of northern families struggle whenever the raiders from Scotland came in, and there are stories of families having £40 a year annual income, and then they're raided and they're bringing in 17 shillings, which in the medieval society, yes, it's during sort of the 13th century, but it would be very comparable. You're talking millions to hundreds, and that's a revenue gone. So I would understand that a family that has come to that sort of situation would marry into a rich noble family in the hopes of getting some of that cheddar. But I don't think that at that stage we're sort of seeing the Butlers flying, and even before Theobald, the connections they already have, it seems like a stretch to me, but again, as with all family history, you can never really rule it out until sort of DNA evidence sort of catches up, but and we'll know for sure then. But yeah, it just seems a bit far-fetched. Now I would say your later line wouldn't have they would have looked at it like Thomas Becket. Wow, let's get that link there. Regardless of who he was before, they probably didn't really know his family, who they worked for, because a lot of records they wouldn't have had access to. We can type it up and just put it in, and we can find a million records. But to go across there to London and to dig it out is either they would hire people, but even then that person, those records might not have been where they are now. They could have been scattered to the four winds. So I just think, it just seems all a bit far-fetched to me. But you never know, there could be some saintly blood in there flowing about those veins.
Who knows?
What's your levitation skills like?
Fish, bread, it's everywhere. It is one of those ones that they obviously believed in the era or the Middle Ages. You know, the seventh Earls of Ormond and sixth Earl of Ormond, they must have believed it because apparently they gave a horn, hunting horn. I'm not sure you'd hold a hunting horn, but they gave one of those to the Boleyn family because to signify this descent from the Beckets or from a sister of Thomas Becket, I think it was actually. But they believed it. I don't see where it fits into the tree. But who knows? Maybe some point down the line we'll find some evidence of that, or evidence to the contrary.
Funny you say a horn. There was a couple of horns stolen from Tullyogue, the forts in hang on, my TV wants to go. In Tullyogue, a couple of old Irish war horns, and a few of them were missing. So I would love to get a wee image of what that horn was like. I wonder one of them made the way to yeah. But no, it's not to call your ancestors thieves, but we want our land back.
Horses and thieves now, and horse thieves.
800 years. And, no, but yeah. So that's his sort of basis at the minute. We haven't even got to him going to Ireland yet.
I know. Well, we'll motor on. I'm thinking the next stop we should do is 1173 because there was a Scots invasion of England. I think it was King David or William the Lion. I think it was actually William the Lion.
It was William the Lion.
He invaded England just when King Henry was having his worst possible year, 1173. His sons, or a couple of his sons, and the earls of this and that and the other, the King of France was involved, and they all rose in rebellion against poor old King Henry II. And King Henry II looked like he was probably the biggest threat to his throne he'd ever faced, really. By this stage, of course, Ireland has been invaded by the Fitzgeralds, many families over there. King Henry himself has also been over to Ireland, kind of put his stamped his authority over the barons. Not only that, but Becket is dead. He's been off by the four knights who were doing their duty. And anyway, in 1173, the major rebellion against King Henry II, led by his sons and wife. And one of the people who actually came out of this huge rebellion with a bit of, basically up money was Ranulph de Glanville, because he had led the defence of the north of England and had seen off William the Lion, I think at the Battle of Alnwick, perhaps it's called.
Something like that, Alnwick. Yeah, it's so it's, you'll have to forgive us anyone watching that this.
I'm going there next week. So
the location.
I really need to learn the lingo.
Learn English before you go across there. Yes, but it's like Alnwick, I think, or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, so he had come. He was very much up money, and he was able to present this captured English king to King Henry II, who was returning from France, pretty much worried that he was going to lose England, and instead he was met by Ranulph de Glanville. Presumably Theobald Walter was there, given that he was so closely allied with him. Presumably they were both there, and they were able to hand over a captured Scottish king to King Henry II, and from that point on, I think. Basically, Ranulph de Glanville was now, from that point on, basically the most important person in the kingdom, certainly the most trusted. And he was given all sorts of titles, maybe not titles, but responsibilities. And as he rose, Theobald Walter, as he was then, rose too. And in 1177, the presumption is that this is the point, 1177, when Prince John, our little nasty Eric Cartman type Prince John, was about 10 years old. Henry II actually decided to name him as Lord of Ireland. The idea being Richard would be in Aquitaine. His second son, this is Prince Richard, one of the sons of King Henry II. His eldest son would obviously be King of England, Duke of Normandy, Count of Anjou. His third son, Geoffrey, would be Duke of Brittany, and Richard would have everything in Aquitaine. And then, well, we've got Ireland, we may as well do something with it. So we'll give it to John, the one who was definitely out to get Fitzwarren. He gave Ireland to him. He was a 10-year-old kid at this time in 1177, so too young to become a king. So what I think he did was Henry II decided to put sort of trusted people in positions of power around him. It seems like in 1177, Theobald Walter was given this hereditary role, which they called Pincerna Hibernus, which we now sort of say is Chief Butler of Ireland.
Yeah.
So 1177, having probably never been to Ireland, Theobald Walter is now given this really huge responsibility to, in the household of the future Lord of Ireland, John. And from this, obviously, is where we derive the surname of Butler. I'm just glad we didn't end up with Pincerna as because that could be
well, I mean,
other directions.
Yeah, I'm surprisingly, I believe there was a earlier link, the Le Butlers, around the 1100s, which became the Albanese or Albanese. Seemed to be, and they were more the Butlers of England at that time rather than of Ireland. So the fact that the Butlers, and they didn't take that sort of title as their own, but the Butlers of Ireland eventually did. Yeah. And I wonder if that's to do with the fact that really very early on, the nobility class, the jobs of court and king and were established in England. There was a lot of them, a lot of positions, a lot of people. In Ireland, it was very small. There wasn't that many because of really they owned most of Ireland in name only, and weren't able to put their stuff. So it's almost like when you start a new business and you got to set up in a garage. And there's 2 years, and you're the Jeff Bezos or whatever.
I'm the chief executive. You're the chief financial officer.
Yeah, and I'm going to change my name, and and everyone's going to know because it's like it's a really important job, even though it's of nowhere, And but and I did get that. I often got a feel from others. It's just like it was almost like a legitimizing claim here, like just because we're the Butlers of Ireland, even though it's like we don't really own Ireland, It's
You've never been.
Yeah, and. I very early on, because other families didn't really take. You don't see the Justiciar family or the Butlers in England, or apart from the branches that obviously would branch off later on from your family. But so I kind of felt, but and they invest in Ireland, and obviously we'll see when they go across. And 1185 was a good investment for them long term. It was definitely a good long term investment.
It was.
Yeah, it took a while for them to because they go across to Prince John, obviously, as you have mentioned plenty of times in previous videos and your books. That this is
it's going to hopefully end.
This is the beginning. It's the
this is the beginning.
It's the end, but this is the beginning. And the new Lord of Ireland, Prince John, and they get given land in Thomond.
So again, in 1170s, we have Normans kind of going into every region of Ireland, apart from sort of Tyrone and Donegal, modern Tyrone and Donegal. Everywhere else has kind of got some effect in some way. Even Tyrone and Donegal, in fairness, have got some effect, felt the effect of the Normans by this stage. However, the big push is really from Leinster, which is pretty much inundated with Norman families at this stage in 1170s. 1177, we see the Normans pushing south into Munster, what's now Munster, against Desmond, South Munster, which is the McCarthy's region, and then north into Thomond, North Munster, which is the O'Briens. And there's lots of details that we're not going to get into right now, but basically Prince John made a horlicks of it. He was pushing out from Waterford in 1185, still trying to go into Munster. And he basically established two big families at that time. The Burke family in South Tipperary, in the sort of Limerick region, Tipperary South. And then in North Tipperary, you get the Butlers, and they're given basically Nina, which is obviously a pretty significant town today, but it just happened to be a place between all these little mini kingdoms. The O'Kennedys over here, the Orions up here, we've got the O'Carrolls a bit over this direction. It just happened to be at the kind of nexus of all these, mini kingdoms in North Tipperary, a land that we now call Ormond. And in Nina, the Butlers very quickly established themselves. In 1185, I think they were granted it, presumably. They were, by 1200, we have Nina Castle, which was in the start of the day, huge, absolutely vast. There's only one remaining tower, but that tower is vast. But there were 5 towers to this castle, so it was a really significant castle. Probably, if you look at what Carrickfergus Castle looks like today, that's probably what we're trying to, the size and scope of this castle. Second only to presumably Limerick in the region. So really a good start for the Butlers. It was a huge amount of land. I would say we're talking in the hundreds of thousands of acres of land that they were granted. They weren't in control of it all, obviously, but they were. I say they. I mean, Theobald Walter, he was in control of it all. He wasn't. I don't think when he arrived in Ireland he was actually married at this stage. I think it was only later that he became married around 1200. He actually got this great marriage to Maud le Vavasour. But he definitely had a lot of land, and he was probably looking, his suddenly from being a, support act to Ranulph de Glanville, he was now a major figure in his own right. So it was quite a trip. Everything else about that trip, apart from the establishment of the Burkes and the Butlers, most of it was a complete disaster. John was out of there within 6 months, back to England, with his tail between his legs, basically, and so it established the Butler family in a few places, as well as Nina. They got, I'm sure they got Arklow, and they also got, I'm going to say Goran, but it might be Goran, Ewran, which is in sort of eastern County Kilkenny. They didn't have Kilkenny, which is sort of the city that's most associated with the Butlers. That in 1185, that was in the hands of the Marshall family. This other family, of course, that are named after a court role. So there's us and there's the Marshalls in Ireland. They must have gotten very confusing.
Yeah, well, it's they get a couple of marshals. It seems that military titles are probably an exception to the rule of adoption of rules. We see the marshals appear in Scotland as well in multiple lines. So it's definitely one that was worn with pride, especially in a chivalry war kind of era. Sergeant, we see that name probably not so much as nobility, but it's definitely a name that's used. Now we touched on this way more detail in another video again on the podcast with Ruadh and Philip from Irish Medieval History. So I will put a link if you're interested in the families that go across Fitzgeralds, and that video gives a whole bigger scope on this sort of time period and just before of the Normans sort of advancing into Ireland. So we won't digress too much into this sort of era. If you want the links, they'll be in the description. But yes, this is the time where Theobald sort of, and like you said, most of that land holding would have been in name only. It would have been forested, outlawry, banditry kind of view to them. These families wouldn't have given them up. He would have had very little hold on the entirety of it, and it would have waxed and waned throughout. Some days Tuesday he'd owned 90% of it, Wednesday he'd 75%, but it didn't matter. It's almost like having stocks and shares. You are rich whether you have the actual asset in your hand, because it's something you can get loaned against. It's just he's a wealthy man now that has this claim to vast amounts of territory, and I believe he was gifted Killaloe in Thomond, or am I?
Wow, okay.
But again, it was, I think it was honorary more than anything, because the O'Briens were not giving Killaloe, the ancestral seat of the O'Briens, away to anybody. But I believe it was awarded, but it was one of the very much like when the De Clares eventually sort of leave Thomond area, that it was. No one went to claim their inheritance, because it was just like, what's the point? You just weren't claiming anything in Thomond at that time. No. But yeah, you say the Butlers by this stage, the honorary title of gifting the wine to the King of Coronation. Yeah. This is the start of. Basically, we touched on it, the Beckets being a merchant family, and this Butlers eventually actually gets very stuck into the merchant side of life. More the tariffs have all, attached to it.
Yeah, I can't imagine it was very easy to get out of these people, but the butlers, they had the right to, it was called the presage of wines, which was sort of varying amounts of every cargo of wine that landed in Ireland, didn't matter where. If you brought wine to Ireland, you had to pay a tax or give over a certain amount of your wine. I think it sort of evens out at about 10% of your cargo to the butlers. And the butlers were therefore ready income of money because there's only so much wine you can hang onto, in my opinion. So I presume that some people would say, well, listen, Theobald, Al, buddy, how about I just give you 17 shillings and we'll say no more about it. I think it was a sort of, we're talking red diesel type of rules here. And they would, they'd slap some money down in this and he'd say, fine, keep your wine, no problem. The idea, I would imagine, is that if the King of England or the Lord of Ireland arrived in Ireland with his whole household, butlers were honour bound to deliver a certain amount of wine to keep them running whilst they were in Ireland. And I would imagine that they thought this was going to happen every few years, probably, that a king would be coming to Ireland. As we know, pretty soon after, Ireland became something of a backwater for the kings of England, and they were always drawn away to France, and they were always drawn away to Scotland and Wales, and rarely came to Ireland. However, this presage of wines, it lasted the whole way down through the entire medieval history. And it was only in 1810 or 1811 that the then Marquis of Ormond sold the rights to the presage of wines back to the crown, or I think probably multi-million, 50, 100 millions, what would now be worth 100 million quid to the crown. So it was real. It was an actual real thing that the butlers had on their hands. Now, how much they made out of it over the years, who knows? But they had this right. So
I think it's fair to say they made a pretty penny, just because you see, and again, we won't go too much into detail here, but you see their involvement in a lot of events in Irish history, and they always seem to bounce back, where families like the De Clares, the Lacys, even the Burkes end up becoming very backwater, and you look at their land holdings, very extremities of the Norman world, or eventually the English grasp of Ireland. Not a very rich trading area. Although, again, I won't go too much, but we would get the Norman families in Limerick and stuff, the 12 merchant families. But as you say, they always seem to be very well established, and they were also very well connected to the English court still all through history. Now that's an expensive hobby even in itself. You didn't go to court if you were struggling financially. You went if you were to be seen. It was the BAFTAs of the day, the Oscars of, and you only went if you were the top dog and earning top penny. And they always went. They always were there. Yeah. So it's court life is very, very important here, and they're there always. And again, it's a sign of wealth to be there, and they obviously had it. To build a castle with 5 humongous towers that they did, it's millions of pounds. Absolutely, a fortune to build a castle. Not only that, but you had to gain the rights to build a castle, and that cost you a penny or two as well, because the king to trust you enough to allow you the right to build a fortified house of any kind.
Well, they did have a bit of an in that regard, because obviously Theobald, we talked at the very start of the video about Theobald having a few younger brothers, and one in particular had basically made it and made the life, Theobald's life, very, very easy. His younger brother Hubert, who we said had joined the church, had become Bishop of Salisbury by the time that King Henry II had died. I think I'm right in saying that he was the Dean of York, which is a sort of the administrator on behalf of the Archbishop of York back in the day. Who the Archbishop of York was actually one of King Henry's illegitimate sons. I digress. He was a very powerful man, this Hubert Walter. He was Bishop of Salisbury, and when Richard, the first Richard the Lionheart, decided he was going to go on a crusade, he said, "Okay, Hubert Walter, you're coming with me." Ran off to Glanville. "You're coming with me. We're off. We're going to the Holy Land." Apparently, what happened was he arrived in the Holy Land and couldn't believe the state of his army, it was in such good nick, and it was all to do with Hubert Walter being such a energetic, really effective administrator, and he just got everything in order. And it was Hubert Walter who, Richard and the Lionheart and Saladin, the Sultan, I suppose he was, never actually met, as far as I know. There were go-betweens, and apparently one of the go-betweens who would have met Saladin was Hubert Walter. So he was obviously very high up in this household of Richard I, Richard the Lionheart. And so when he came back, Richard sent notes ahead saying, listen, this guy is going to be my Archbishop of Canterbury. Mm-hmm. This guy is going to be my, Justiciar. This guy is going to be my Lord Chancellor. So Hubert Walter arrived back in England in, 1193? 1192? Yeah. 1190s anyway. And he arrived back, and Eleanor of Aquitaine met him and said, right, you're doing this, this, and this. And so he was basically in charge of England. And I suspect that Hubert was sitting there going, well, this is great. I've got loads of work to do. Well, that's great. I'm Archbishop of Canterbury. I'm the Regent of England, and I'm the Justiciar. Oh my God, there's a lot of work. Mm-hmm. Make matters worse, Richard actually, on the way back from the Holy Land, as everybody knows, got captured by Archduke of Austria. And was imprisoned.
Languished in prison until he was ransomed by the whole cost them about basically what was it, like 90% of the revenue for
90% of England.
It was a ridiculous amount. Basically, I think England was still paying it off until the Second World War. It was a ridiculous amount.
The Butler plan.
Yeah, but no, something we should just mention is that although he was an English king, he wasn't really. He was a French king. He was French and he was English in the fact that it was his territory, and that was about it. It was a money bank for him even before the fine for release. Not fine, but Hubert. So basically, Hubert had free reign of this place, was ruling in the king's name, and a king that had very little interest in anything but the money coming back his way. Didn't care what happened the other way. So he did have fingers in every pie, puppet pulling every string.
Yeah.
He had the power to do that. It wouldn't be a farce. Although, like say, the charters and stuff wouldn't be here, and a lot of it would be sleight of hand, and but he basically ruled as a king there, and he had every legitimate right to do so because he had the king's blessing. Because the king didn't care.
Seemingly his trust as well. So this is the sort of person that Hubert Walter. Very, very effective administrator as well, by all accounts, because he was able to raise this ransom to get Richard free. I don't know the history of that period of when Richard was in Austria and imprisoned and what happened and how it all came about, but Hubert Walter was the guy behind it, presumably with Eleanor of Aquitaine, presumably with William Marshall on hand as well. In any event, Prince John, whilst his brother was languishing in prison, decided, my moment has come. This is where I'm going to take power. And he launched a rebellion in 1194. And one of the first places that he decided that he was going to take, because it was one of the great castles of the north of England, was Lancaster. Who was the sheriff of Lancaster at the time? Theobald Walter. Hubert had put his bestest brother into, basically in charge of what is now Lancashire. Mm-hmm. And John thought, well, this is my oldest friend. I've made him Chief Butler of Ireland. I've given him all this land in Ireland. I've given him bits of Leinster and bits of Munster. He's going to be on my side because we're pals. He's like a big brother to me. Yeah. He barely knows Hubert Walter, but he's like a big brother to me. And Theobald went, I'm sorry. Blood is thicker than water. Yeah. And he decided to bar the gates. He wouldn't allow John into Lancaster. And through one thing and another, the rebellion basically fell apart. Not quite overnight, but pretty close to it. And it was all because Theobald decided to support Hubert and through him Richard rather than his old friend John. And I think it's at that time when John said, you're going on my list. Look, Fitzwarren, Theobald Walter. That's my list. That's it. And it was again, maybe Theobald was going, well, Richard's a young man. He's got a new wife. He's just come out of prison. He is going to have kids. Come on, he's going to have loads of kids. There's no way this is going to be a problem for me.
Yeah.
And then 5 years later, John became King of England. And one of his first moves, despite retaining Hubert Walter as his kind of, main man, his main his justiciar and prime minister and all that, he declared Theobald Walter to be outlawed, and Theobald was basically fled England and back to Ireland. And I don't know if he ever came back to England. He certainly was in control of his lands, even though they'd been taken off him. He just set up camp and just said, no, Nina's a a long way from London. I'm staying there.
A lot of it. We did get a lot of over here in Ireland. We did get a lot of the exiled knights and families. It was the place to. It was, like I said, it was land that wasn't really owned by the king in anything but name, and an established administrator knight like Theobald to go in and set up camp there would have been very easy, not only with his connections that he had already, but just because of how Ireland was at the time very tribal, it wouldn't have been very hard for him to establish himself. He would have been doing this anyway in the background, trying to establish his territory, make sure, even regardless of the thought of him having to escape out the back door and end up there, because this would have been his revenue eventually. So he would have been going to a very solid base that he effectively owned, because no English sort of army would have gone there unless it was a full campaign. And it cost John more to go and chase him than actually for him to, as we see in future campaigns in Ireland, just how expensive it would be for the monarchs of England. But yeah, and he was very busy there once he got there, building himself up and having to deal with the Irish lords there and their shenanigans. And he got very stuck in, very much like the rest of his descendants, into proxy wars and political backstabbings and murdering McCarthy lords and
one McCarthy lord.
And he
Sorry, McCarthy's.
Yeah, and he wasn't really him, it was his men, so can you really blame him?
Who knows?
He wasn't holding a knife. Is that a gun doesn't kill, the person holding the gun is the bullet that killed him kind of scenario?
Yeah, I think we're going to have to take that one in the chin. I think we totally double-crossed poor O'Donnell McCarthy.
It wouldn't be the first or the last for any family there. The Irish were worse at it than but yes, but that was his. He spent a lot of time there doing that. I'm just trying to think where I think that's where really it's sort of.
Presumably that's he was about 1200. I think we're sort of, his only son was born around 1200. So presumably he'd been married maybe a couple of years before that, maybe just after the tail end of Richard's reign in England. So he had a couple of kids there. He had sisters marrying into a chap called Orm Magnusson, who was definitely not Norman fellow. I think Orm was probably a descendant of, the Norse Gael, who had set up camp in Lancashire. So he had, they weren't marrying his sister. I think it was married into the Orm Magnusson family in Lancashire. He was set up there a wee bit as well. He had also one of his daughters called Beatrice married into the Purcell family, who would remain basically Butler's most loyal retainers, lieutenants, over the next 600 years. The Purcell family are going in there, and they became Barons Lochmoe, which is just outside Thurles in County Tipperary. Presumably at this stage is when sort of other families from Kilkenny and Tipperary became into the Butler service. They've got the Cantwells and the Comerfords and the Grace family, Grace. So all these families that are still numerous descendants in that region, this is the period when they come to Ireland and sort of set up alongside Theobald Walter at all their various bases, Tipperary, North Kilkenny.
When we forget when we talk about people leaving the country or going to a new country, that we forget about the retinue that follows them. These aren't just one man on a horse and cloak over the face and the Dock of Liverpool and bugging out. These are, they would have had their household, their retinue, their marshals, their own sort of lords and knights, and but yeah, he spends time, like I say, establishing himself and his family, building abbeys that we see, from Limerick to Wicklow to literally the breadth of the country, very active in building up these towns that actually would become towns, big trading hubs and stuff. So he's very busy to even have to go back to England to deal with that. He's actually got quite a lot on his hands but he does sort of this is sort of the end of what we can sort of discern from. It really does become more of he just sort of drops off the map because a lot of things are starting to happen all over the country, and as anyone who follows history, it's a bit like medical, or anything medical has been found out through war, because it's the best chance to practice medicine, and it seems to be the best place for history too. Is war. It just follows war. Nothing, if it's something quiet in the background, you'd be lucky to get a mention, even if it leads to something big. But yeah, I mean, I think that's really the main point of of his life.
I think that bit where after he is sort of ejected from England and he's forced to spend time in Ireland, I suspect that's probably his most important. That actually turns out to be the most important, because it really means that he's building up Mina as a power base. He's building up Arklow as a power base. He's building up Gowran as well. Again, Gowran is one of the most productive farming regions in Ireland, in any part of Ireland. It's and they're putting down wheat. They're not they're not going in the same way that the Irish would have traditionally done. Yes, they had agriculture or arable farming, but they've mainly dealt in cattle and moving their herds around, from the summer pastures up in the hills down to the winter pastures in the lowlands. Normans are there and they're putting wheat down. They're putting fields and fields of wheat, and they're turning Ireland. Quite a bit of what we now see as Ireland is that kind of green fields, and that's coming to for the Normans, because they're putting down wheat, which they can make bread, which they can feed far more people from a single field than you can if you put cattle on it. That's the kind of things I think that he's doing. We see, I think every kid in UK, Ireland have all had to have a history lesson about the feudal system, about field rotation, and about the manor system and all this kind of stuff. This is what he's doing. He's dealing out parcels of land to his followers. He's setting up castles, and he's saying to the church, listen, Cistercians from Lancashire, why don't you take this parcel of land and you can put a church on it, and you know what, you can set it up and you can start brewing beer and all the normal things that Cistercian monks did to great success. It just generates income for Theobald Walter, and in these 3 zones he's doing all this all the time. And it really is in this period that it sets the Butler, he's still Theobald Walter, but they will soon become the Butler clan, the Butler dynasty. Right. But he's setting them up in this this is the point where everything comes to, where it really starts to generate income and be made into something for the long term.
We've touched on this before in our other videos about how a lot of families set a precedent very early on and stuck to that. The Burkes being very wary, the Fitzgeralds also being quite fighty, maybe a bit sort of a foot in each camp. Burke's completely war-headed, just gun-ho. Fitzgerald's a bit of foot on each side. And I always thought the Butlers were very, very stewardship, very, very, had that, almost like administrative genetic line. They were so much more in tune. It's a very generic stamp, obviously, but for most of their leadership, we're very much in tune with the land and the running of it and the administration and just that sort of, rather than picking up a sword and just fighting everyone around them, and and it's something that I feel is when you look at the families that have survived in Ireland, the Norman families, and their sort of power bases and stuff like that. The Burkes completely smashed. Fitzgeralds, they split into branches. The Butlers still, even to this day, still have such a prominent hold on a lot of areas and titles, and they are very, if you were to group their holdings together as a family and group, they would still be very prominent family in Ireland. Yeah, I mean,
Could be better. Could be better.
I'm considering it's the site's a republic now in Northern Ireland. Excluding the sort of the wider picture of the political stance of these places, it would still, there are still families, branches, like you said there, with your link there, baronies and stuff within the family. Yeah, and that is, but you find other families that have that link, and the list is minimal now. Well, especially native Irish ones. That's I think there's like 3 or 4 just holding native Irish. But is that the O'Briens who sort of join the English? Oh, how dare they?
I find it a wee bit odd, just mention the O'Briens, that the first place that we presumably came into contact. Okay, we had a bit of a murder of the McCarthys. That probably pleased the O'Briens. Yeah. We literally invaded their territory. The Butlers were planted in their territory on their eastern border. We were there, and we were only planted there for one reason: to be a blooming great threat or thorn in the side of the O'Briens. Mm-hmm. And yet, over the next couple of hundred years, along with the Burkes, I don't think there was any family closer to the Butlers than the O'Briens. They were extremely, okay, it wasn't always that way, but by the 1600s, it was the O'Briens and the Butlers were pretty much vying off against the Fitzgerald powers, and it's a wee bit odd that we ended up in that way.
I think the O'Briens were very good at using Normanites. We'll see that anyway. Norman families in O'Brien territory were very good. They did a very similar thing to David I of Scotland, which was, rather than see the people as a complete threat and having them eventually just swarm them anyway, was to give them parcels of land on the pretext that they sort of owed a bit of leadership to. They were used as buffer states. They were used as sometimes as the knights and for their armies, trainers of soldiers. So they were very good. They weren't so nationalistic on their identity of their Kingdom of O'Brien as, say, other nations of Ireland at the time, who would have been like no foreigners at all kind of mentality. And we see in the long run that didn't play out very well. The Butlers, again, being more astute and not so war-headed, probably were quite out. They probably owned Killaloe to them. They were, and they said the O'Briens, you own it too, and you just pay me.
Love.
Yeah, you just pay me to not do anything about that. A couple of pence a
just send a few cattle.
Cattle, and I tell you what, if I come calling when the McCarthys come knocking on my door, you don't like them anyway, so let's just but we all know that they were, not just them, but all the Norman families were very, very good at, like, say, proxy war in the country and stuff like that. So, but I think that's it. We'll call it the end here. Yeah. I think we've covered about as much as can be covered without digressing too far ahead. So, Ruadh, thanks very much for coming on and having a wee chat. And this video will lead on to the Butler family video, which will cover more of the family history. The reason for this video was because the Proginator had such an interesting life from what we can gather from the sources, and I wouldn't have been able to cover that in one short family video that I do, and I just felt that this would be a good way to sort of set it up. So you will see the Butler clan video coming next, where I'll go into more detail on the rest of the family, the land holdings, but this is where it started. And so yeah, thanks again, and all the links to all the videos we've mentioned are below. Links to Ruadh's book will be below. Check it out. It's a great read. It's so great, in fact, I've robbed him of payment for one of the books because I've lent it to a friend. But they'll hopefully buy the second and third one. But to be fair, I have bought it twice. So, yeah, that's it. Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
I'd only
two
spend it on
barrels.
something that's bad for me.
two barrels of payment, 10%. There you go. You've got 2 books. So thanks again, Rue, and I'll see you all soon. Bye bye.
Rabu.
You had to throw it in there, didn't you?